14 sovereign nations, 210 million people, one exchange rate that none of them control. This is a deep dive into the geopolitical history of African economics in the monetary system that has outlasted colonialism itself. The CFA franc is pegged to the euro at 655.957 to 1. That number has not moved in over 30 years. Not because the economies it governs haven't needed it to move, but because the governments subject to it do not have the authority to move it. That decision belongs to France. It has always belonged to France. That is not an interpretation, it is written into the architecture of the system. In 1994, 14 heads of state were informed of a 50% overnight devaluation the day before it happened. Not consulted, informed.
The price of food and medicine across the franc zone doubled by morning. No African government made that decision. No African government could have stopped it. In November 2024, 95% of West Africans surveyed said they want out of this system. As of March 2026, not one country is left. This is the story of how a monetary system built in 1945 to serve French Reconstruction is still running, and why escaping it is harder than it looks. If that's the kind of analysis you want more of, subscribe. New video every week.
On December 26, 1945, France ratified the Bretton Woods agreements. On the same day, in the same act, it created the CFA franc. The timing was deliberate, but the motive is frequently misread. The official explanation, offered by Finance Minister René Pleven, was that France wished to spare its colonies from the devaluation the French franc was about to absorb. The French economy had been devastated by the war. To peg the franc to the dollar at Bretton Woods, Paris had to accept a significant depreciation. Pleven's stated logic was generosity. The colonies had suffered less, so they should not pay France's monetary price. The actual logic was economic reconstruction. With the CFA franc pegged above the French franc, France could purchase raw materials from its African territories without spending dollars, using its own colonial currency instead. The colony's dollar export earnings flowed back to Paris. France gained access to captive markets and a cushion against dollar scarcity, all while describing the arrangement as a gift. The acronym said it plainly: Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, French Colonies of Africa. The franc of the French Colonies of Africa. The system rested on three structural pillars. First, a fixed exchange rate. The franc could not float and could not be devalued without French approval. Second, a convertibility guarantee. France promised that CFA francs could always be exchanged for French francs, later euros, at the fixed rate. Third, the operations account. Member central banks were required to deposit a portion of their foreign exchange reserves in an account at the French Treasury. At creation, that portion was 100%. By 1973, it had been negotiated down to 65%. By 2005, to 50%. The guarantee justified the deposit enabled the guarantee. Neither could exist without the other, which is precisely what made the system so difficult to reform. By 1960, France had granted formal independence to most of its sub-Saharan territories. President de Gaulle made CFA membership an implicit condition of decolonization. Guinea, under Sékou Touré, refused and chose its own currency. France withdrew all technical assistance within weeks and removed everything it could carry: furniture, files, the telephone infrastructure. The message reached the other capitals. Independence arrived, the franc stayed. During his 1993 re-election campaign, Senegalese President Abdou Diouf made a promise to his citizens. The CFA franc would not be devalued. He was specific, he was public, he was wrong, though not by choice. On January 12, 1994, the CFA franc was devalued by 50% overnight. The parity rate moved from 50 CFA francs per French franc to 100. It was not a Senegalese decision, or a Burkinabe decision, or an Ivorian decision. It was a decision made jointly by the French Treasury and the IMF, implemented on a timeline set in Paris and announced to the heads of state of 14 nations the day before it happened. By morning, the price of imported goods across the franc zone had effectively doubled. Diouf's promise, made less than a year earlier, was worthless. Not because he broke it, but because the instrument required to keep it was not in his hands. The devaluation resolved the immediate problem. The franc had become chronically overvalued as commodity prices fell through the late 1980s, making franc zone exports uncompetitive and draining the operations account. The economics were real. What the 1994 event revealed was something distinct from the economics. It revealed that the most consequential monetary decision affecting 200 million people, a decision that would determine the price of food, medicine, and imports for every household in the zone, could be made in Paris and implemented before those governments could respond. The devaluation was announced to African heads of state the day before it took effect. It was not their decision to announce. That structural fact is what the CFA Franc's defenders and critics are actually arguing about. The debate is rarely about whether the fixed rate produces stability. It demonstrably does, at least by inflation metrics. Franc zone countries have historically had lower inflation than comparable non-franc zone sub-Saharan economies. The Banque de France cites this as the system's primary justification. The debate is about who pays the cost of that stability and who decides when the rate has to change. In 1994, the answer to both questions was the same, not the 14 member states.
In December 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron and Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara stood together in Abidjan and announced what was described in the French press as a historic step toward African monetary sovereignty. The West African franc would be renamed. France would withdraw from the governance bodies of the BCEAO, the West African Central Bank, and the operations account, the reserve deposit at the French Treasury, would be closed. For the 8 WEMOA countries, the account was indeed closed. By the end of 2020, the West African Central Bank repatriated its reserves and began managing them independently. By 2023, the BCEAO was generating 176.96 billion CFA francs in annual returns on those reserves, invested in bank deposits, debt securities, and IMF assets. Professor Amath Ndiaye of Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar noted the irony. The BIAC in Central Africa, which was not reformed, earned 196.7 billion CFA francs in 2023 from its deposits still held at the French Treasury, an increase of 358% from the previous year, driven by ECB rate hikes. Both central banks were earning market returns. The difference was where the money sat and who controlled it. For the 6 CEMAC nations, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, the Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon, the 2019 reform changed nothing. The operations account remains. France retains seats in CEMAC's governance bodies. The 50% reserve deposit requirement is intact. Central Africa was not invited to the Abidjan announcement. As of 2026, no equivalent reform has been agreed for the zone. France has stated it is open to discussions. The discussions have not produced an outcome. For both zones, what did not change is the element that determines monetary policy. The fixed exchange rate to the euro remains at 655.957 to 1. The convertibility guarantee, and with it France's ultimate authority over any devaluation, remains. The monetary policy of the franc zone continues to be set by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, which answers to European governments, not to the finance ministers of Dakar or Yaoundé. When Ivory Coast's cocoa sector needs a competitive exchange rate, and cocoa is priced in dollars on global markets, while Ivorian farm costs are paid in euros via the franc, the ECB's rate-setting decisions may be entirely indifferent to that need. There is no mechanism to make them otherwise. The renamed eco-currency, announced in 2019 as the symbol of that new sovereignty, has not been launched. The current target date is July 2027. It is the 5th such target date since 2003.
On January 29, 2025, the flags of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were removed from the ECOWAS headquarters in Abuja. The 3 countries had formally withdrawn from the regional bloc, their military governments citing what they called illegal sanctions imposed after their coups. It was the most significant fracture in West African regional integration since ECOWAS was founded in 1975. All 3 countries remain, for now, inside UEMOA. They continue to use the CFA franc.
They continued to be bound by the fixed rate and the convertibility guarantee. The new currency they have discussed creating remains a discussion. In November 2024, the Sciences Po Center for International Research published its survey findings. 95% of West Africans expressed the desire to leave the franc zone. That figure has no historical parallel in the zone's 80-year history. It does not resolve the economic question of whether leaving is viable. Dango Samba Sila, the Senegalese economist who has written the most comprehensive history of the franc zone, argues that the exit is achievable with preparation. The IMF's modeling suggests the transition risks are significant. Both positions contain empirical support. The survey result establishes something neither position disputes. The population subject to the system no longer regards it as legitimate. Senegal's president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, elected in 2024 on an explicit platform of CFA reform, stated in May 2025 that the franc poses both a symbolic and an economic problem for his country. In the same month, Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko called the system incompatible with genuine sovereignty. Senegal is not a Sahel military government. It is a stable democracy, one of the most institutionally developed in West Africa, and its two most senior elected officials are now publicly on record against the currency the country uses. That is a different category of political pressure than the junta governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. It is harder to dismiss as instability. The underlying economic argument against the franc, distinct from the political one, runs through the competitiveness channel. When the European Central Bank raises rates, as it did aggressively between 2022 and 2023, the euro strengthens. A stronger euro means a stronger CFA franc. Ivory Coast, the world's largest cocoa exporter, prices its cocoa in dollars on global commodity markets, but pays domestic production costs in a currency that tracks the euro. When the euro rises against the dollar, Ivorian cocoa export revenues converted back into francs buy less. The country's export competitiveness deteriorates, not because of any domestic policy decision, but because of rate decisions made in Frankfurt in response to European inflation conditions. The IMF's own Article 4 consultation on UEMOA in 2022 documented this effect, describing real effective exchange rate appreciation relative to trading partners and recommended structural reforms to improve competitiveness. The mechanism producing that appreciation was not addressed.
The CFA franc has existed for 80 years. In that time, it has been reformed once in a way that changed something material. For the 8 countries of UEMOA, the operations account is closed. Their reserves are their own to manage. France no longer sits on the BCEAO's board. Those are real changes. The fixed exchange rate to the euro remains at 655.957 to 1. The convertibility guarantee, and with it France's authority over the rate, remains. The ECO has not launched. For the 6 countries of CEMAC, the operations account is still in Paris. French representatives remain in the governance structure. Nothing has changed. Across both zones, covering 210 million people in 14 economies, the rate that determines export competitiveness, import costs, and the price of debt service is set by a committee in Frankfurt that none of them sit on. The 1994 devaluation, announced to 14 heads of state the day before it happened, established the operational meaning of that arrangement with precision that no reform has since altered. The flags changed in 1960. The monetary policy framework that preceded independence outlasted them. It is still in place. The most consequential decision available to any of these 14 governments is whether to leave a system they did not design, using tools they are still assembling. All primary sources for this video: IMF Article 4 reports, BCEAO and BEAC data, the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs Monetary Cooperation documentation, the Sciences Po survey, and the full bibliography are linked in the description.